August 23rd, 1914. You're a German infantry officer leading your men across the Belgian countryside toward a small industrial town called Mons. Your regiment is part of the mighty German First Army, over 300,000 men, advancing in perfect formation toward what your commanders promise will be a quick victory over the British Expeditionary Force. Intelligence reports tell you that you're facing maybe 70,000 British soldiers, a small force that should be easily swept aside by German superiority in numbers and tactics. Your men are confident, singing marching songs as they advance. The war will be over by Christmas, just as the Kaiser promised. But as you crest a hill overlooking the Mont Condé Canal, something stops you cold. The sound coming from the British positions isn't what you expected. It's not the slow, methodical crack of bolt-action rifles. It's a continuous, devastating roar that sounds like dozens of machine guns firing simultaneously. But here's what will shock you about what happened at Mons. The British didn't have dozens of machine guns. They had something far more dangerous. Soldiers who could fire their rifles so fast and so accurately that German officers were convinced they were facing automatic weapons. What you're hearing is the sound of the most perfectly trained riflemen in military history, turning their weapons into instruments of mass destruction. Today, I'm going to tell you the complete story of the Battle of Mons, how British soldiers achieved the impossible with nothing but bolt-action rifles, and why this forgotten battle changed the course of World War I before most people even knew the war had begun. To understand what made the Battle of Mons so extraordinary, you need to understand the British soldiers who fought there. The British Expeditionary Force that landed in France in August 1914 wasn't a conscript army of farmers and factory workers hastily trained for war. These were professional soldiers, men who had enlisted for long terms of service and had spent years perfecting their craft. The backbone of the BEF was the British Regular Infantry, soldiers who had served in the far corners of the Empire, fighting in India, Afghanistan, South Africa, and dozens of other colonial conflicts. These men had learned their trade in real combat, not on parade grounds. They knew how to shoot, how to move, and how to survive under fire. But what made these soldiers truly exceptional was their marksmanship training. The British Army had developed the most rigorous rifle training program in the world, based on lessons learned from the Boer War, where accurate long-range shooting had proven decisive. Every British soldier was required to qualify as a marksman, and the standards were incredibly demanding. A trained British infantryman was expected to fire 15 aimed rounds per minute from his Lee Enfield rifle and hit a man-sized target at 300 yards with every shot. The best marksman could fire 20 or even 25 rounds per minute while maintaining deadly accuracy. This wasn't just theory. It was a skill that had been drilled into these men through thousands of hours of practice. The Lee Enfield rifle itself was perfectly suited to this kind of rapid, accurate fire. Unlike the German Mauser or the French Liebel, the Lee Enfield had a smooth bolt action that allowed experienced soldiers to work it without taking the rifle from their shoulder. The magazine held 10 rounds instead of the 5 rounds, common in other rifles, and it could be reloaded quickly using stripper clips. But the real secret of British marksmanship wasn't the rifle. It was the training system. British soldiers practiced what they called rapid fire, the ability to fire multiple aimed shots as quickly as possible while maintaining accuracy. They trained until working, the bolt became automatic, until they could reload without looking, until they could estimate range and adjust their sights instinctively. The German army that advanced toward Mons had no idea what they were about to face. German military doctrine emphasized mass attacks by large formations, supported by artillery and machine guns. German soldiers were trained to advance in dense columns, relying on their superior numbers to overwhelm enemy positions. This tactic had worked well in previous European wars, but it had never been tested against soldiers who could fire 15 accurate rounds per minute. The German First Army advancing toward Mons was commanded by General Alexander von Kluck, an experienced officer who was confident in his ability to crush the small British force. His army included some of Germany's finest regiments, men who had trained for years for this moment. They advanced in perfect formation, flags flying, bands playing, convinced that German discipline and courage would carry the day. The British Expeditionary Force was commanded by Field Marshal Sir John French, who had positioned his men along the Mons Canal. The canal provided a natural defensive barrier, but it was the quality of the men behind it that would make the real difference. The British had only 2 corps, about 70,000 men, facing a German force more than 4 times their size. The British positions were well chosen, but not particularly strong. The canal was only about 20 feet wide and could be crossed at numerous bridges and fords. The British had blown some of the bridges, but there were still plenty of crossing points available to the Germans. What the British lacked in defensive positions, they would have to make up for with superior firepower. As the German advance began on the morning of August 23rd, British soldiers took their positions along the canal. They had been ordered to hold their fire until the Germans came within effective range, about 400 yards. The men checked their rifles, adjusted their sights, and waited for the enemy to appear. The first German units to approach the canal were reconnaissance troops, probing for weak points in the British line. British marksmen picked them off with single, well-aimed shots. But these were just the advance guard. Behind them came the main German assault. Thousands of men in gray uniforms advancing in dense formations across the open ground. What happened next was unlike anything seen in European warfare. As the German columns came within range, British soldiers opened fire with a precision and rapidity that stunned their enemies. The Lee Enfield rifles cracked in a continuous roar, each shot carefully aimed, each bullet finding its mark. German officers later reported that they were convinced they were facing machine gun positions. The volume of fire was so intense, so sustained, that it seemed impossible that it could be coming from bolt-action rifles operated by individual soldiers. But that's exactly what it was. Hundreds of professional soldiers firing as fast as they could work their bolts, each man maintaining the deadly accuracy that had been drilled into him through years of training. The German casualties were horrific. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The neat formations that had advanced so confidently across the Belgian countryside dissolved into chaos as soldiers sought cover from the devastating British fire. Officers trying to rally their men were picked off by British marksmen who could hit individual targets at ranges that seemed impossible. The psychological impact on the German soldiers was as devastating as the physical casualties. These men had been told they were facing a small, demoralized British force that would flee at the first sign of serious resistance. Instead, they found themselves under fire from what seemed like an army of expert marksmen who could kill them from distances they had never imagined possible. German attempts to cross the canal were met with withering fire that cut down entire companies. At the Nîmes Bridge, a single British platoon held off repeated German attacks, their rifles firing so rapidly that German survivors reported facing at least 6 machine guns, when there were actually only about 30 men with rifles. The most famous incident of the battle occurred when Private Sidney Godley of the Royal Fusiliers single-handedly held the Nîmes railway bridge against an entire German battalion. Godley fired his rifle so rapidly and accurately that the Germans were convinced they were facing a machine gun nest. He held his position until he was severely wounded, allowing his comrades to retreat safely. But the British couldn't hold forever. Despite their superior marksmanship, they were vastly outnumbered, and German artillery was beginning to find their positions. As the day wore on, ammunition began to run low, and casualties mounted. The British had inflicted enormous losses on the Germans, but they couldn't stop the sheer weight of numbers pressing against their thin line. By late afternoon, it became clear that the British position was becoming untenable. German forces had found crossing points, up and down the canal, and British units were in danger of being surrounded. Field Marshal French ordered a fighting withdrawal, and the British began to pull back from their positions along the canal. The withdrawal from Mons was as skillfully executed as the defense had been. British rearguard actions continued to inflict heavy casualties on pursuing German forces. The same marksmanship skills that had made the defense so effective now protected the retreating British columns as marksmen picked off German officers and machine gun crews at long range. The Battle of Mons lasted only one day, but its impact was enormous. The British had inflicted over 5,000 casualties on the German First Army, while suffering fewer than 1,600 casualties themselves. More importantly, they had shattered German confidence and disrupted the carefully planned timetable of the Schlieffen Plan. The German advance, which was supposed to sweep through Belgium and northern France in a matter of weeks, had been slowed and bloodied by a force less than a quarter of its size. The delay at Mons, combined with similar delays at other battles, gave the French time to reorganize their forces and prepare for the decisive Battle of the Marne. The marksmanship displayed by British soldiers at Mons became legendary. German prisoners reported that they had been convinced they were facing automatic weapons, not rifles. German officers wrote in their reports that the British had an unusually large number of machine guns, when in fact the British had only 2 machine guns per battalion, about the same as the Germans. The Mad Minute, the British Army's standard test of rapid fire, became famous after Mons. Soldiers who could fire 15 rounds per minute were considered competent, but the best marksmen could fire 20, 25, or even 30 rounds per minute while maintaining deadly accuracy. At Mons, this training paid off in the most dramatic way possible. The psychological impact of Mons extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German soldiers began to develop a healthy respect for British marksmanship that would influence their tactics for the rest of the war. The idea that individual British soldiers were exceptionally dangerous became embedded in German military thinking. The British press, desperate for good news in the early days of the war, seized on the story of Mons and turned it into a legend. Stories of British soldiers holding off entire German regiments with nothing but their rifles captured the public imagination. The Old Contemptibles, as the BEF soldiers called themselves, after the Kaiser's alleged reference to Britain's contemptible little army, became national heroes. But the victory at Mons came at a cost. The British Expeditionary Force had been badly mauled, and many of its most experienced soldiers had been killed or wounded. The professional army that had fought so magnificently at Mons would be largely destroyed in the battles of 1914 and 1915, replaced by the volunteer and conscript armies that would fight the rest of the war. The tactical lessons of Mons were studied by military experts around the world. The battle demonstrated the continued importance of individual marksmanship in an age of machine guns and artillery. It showed that well-trained soldiers with bolt-action rifles could still be decisive on the modern battlefield, at least under the right circumstances. The Battle of Mons also highlighted the importance of professional military training. The British soldiers who fought there weren't superior because of their equipment or their numbers. They were superior because of their training and experience. Years of practice had turned them into the most effective riflemen in the world, and that training made all the difference when it mattered most. The legend of Mons grew in the telling, and some of the stories became exaggerated over time. Tales of British soldiers firing 30 or 40 rounds per minute, while impressive, were probably exceptional rather than typical. But the core truth remained. British soldiers at Mons achieved something remarkable with nothing but their rifles and their training. The German response to Mons was to increase their respect for British fighting ability, while also adapting their tactics. German forces began to approach British positions more cautiously, using artillery and machine guns to suppress British riflemen before attempting infantry attacks. The days of massed infantry charges against well-trained marksmen were over. The international impact of Mons was also significant. The battle demonstrated that the German army, despite its size and reputation, was not invincible. This gave hope to Germany's enemies and encouraged neutral countries to believe that the war might not end in a quick German victory. The technological implications of Mons were complex. On one hand, the battle seemed to demonstrate the continued relevance of the individual soldier and his rifle. On the other hand, it also showed the limitations of even the best-trained infantry when faced with overwhelming numbers and superior firepower. The Battle of Mons marked the end of an era in military history. It was probably the last time that individual marksmanship would play such a decisive role in a major battle. The war that followed would be dominated by machine guns, artillery, and poison gas. Weapons that made individual skill less important than industrial production and technological innovation. But for one day, in August 1914, the old ways of warfare proved their worth. British soldiers with bolt-action rifles achieved something that seemed impossible, turning their weapons into instruments of mass destruction through nothing but skill, training, and courage. The sound of their rifles, firing so rapidly that they seemed like machine guns, echoed across the battlefield and into history. The Battle of Mons proved that in warfare, as in many other fields, quality can sometimes triumph over quantity. The British soldiers who fought there were outnumbered more than 4-1, but their superior training and marksmanship allowed them to inflict devastating casualties on their enemies while holding their positions for an entire day. The legacy of Mons lived on in British military culture for decades. The idea that British soldiers were the best marksmen in the world became an article of faith, and the training methods that had produced the heroes of Mons continued to influence British military doctrine well into the 20th century. Today, the Battle of Mons is remembered as one of the finest examples of professional soldiering in military history. It showed what was possible when excellent training met desperate circumstances, and it demonstrated that individual skill and courage could still make a difference on the modern battlefield. If you found this story of incredible marksmanship and military skill as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out the videos on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.